U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with China's president on the third and final day of a visit fraught with tensions. The two nations disagree on a range of issues, from Ukraine to China's territorial claims, but Blinken stressed that it was crucial for Washington and Beijing to maintain open channels of communication.
Two rival powers try to find common ground. China's President Xi Jinping welcomed U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Beijing. Despite core differences on trade, security, and geopolitics, Xi expressed hope for the future.
China is willing to see a confident and open U.S. with prosperity and development. It is hoped that the U.S. can also look at China's development positively. Only when this fundamental issue is resolved and the first step is taken will China-U.S. relations be truly stabilized, improved, and moved forward.
During his three-day visit, Blinken raised concerns about China's territorial claims in Taiwan and the South China Sea. He also accused the People's Republic of China, or PRC, of fueling the war in Ukraine by supporting Russia's weapons industry.
In my discussions today, I reiterated our serious concern about the PRC providing components that are powering Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. Russia would struggle to sustain its assault on Ukraine without China's support.
China's foreign minister has accused the U.S. of trying to stifle its economic and technological development, as well as its regional expansion.
The China-U.S. relationship is facing more negative factors and all kinds of disruptions. China's legitimate development rights have been unreasonably suppressed, and our core interests are facing challenges. Should China and the U.S. stay on the right path of moving forward with stability or return to a downward spiral? This is a major question facing our two countries and tests our sincerity and ability.
The path forward includes holding formal talks about the risks of artificial intelligence in the coming weeks.
Let's get more with George Magnus. He's an economist and research associate at the China Center at Oxford University in the UK. Thank you so much for joining DW today. Now, relations between the U.S. and China hit a low point last year. What would you say after this visit? Are tensions easing?
Well, I think that both sides are trying to stabilize what is in effect, not a great relationship, because they both have interests to do so. In China, the economy is in bad shape. Xi Jinping is trying to sort of steer the economy away from its reliance on property and infrastructure to something new. Very, very high youth unemployment. I think everybody knows these kinds of stories. In America, it's got involvement, obviously, in the Middle East, in Ukraine. There's a presidential election coming up in November. So nobody really wants an explosion or a rift that we saw, for example, during the balloon incident last year, and then, before that, over Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So, yeah, there's a bit of flowery and fuzzy language that you can hear on both sides, but if you don't have to kind of look or listen terribly finely, actually, to hear that there is quite a tension between the United States and China. And actually, the Chinese side, I thought, was quite threatening. Wang Yi's language, I thought, was rather inappropriate for a meeting like this, to be honest.
Blinken wants China to stop supporting Russia's war in Ukraine. Both the U.S. and China are interested in stabilizing ties. You said it there. But is China keen enough to change policy in what it calls a no-limits friendship with Moscow?
Yeah, I don't think so, to be honest. I mean, to be fair, Chinese banks have been quite careful not to be seen to be facilitating the financing of, military commerce or anything like that, for fear of the secondary sanctions which the United States might levy. But obviously, U.S. intelligence must have some kind of information about the activities of Chinese companies shipping products and military goods or support goods to the Russians, which may be financed by smaller banks, which are not really in the main kind of focus of international finance. So I think that's the kind of gist of Blinken's warning, which is that there would be further sanctions if China doesn't really kind of sit on this. I suspect that's exactly what's going to happen, by the way.
Mm-hmm. China and the U.S., you mentioned the economy there. It's always a huge topic between them because they are the world's two largest economies. They need each other, but they're also in fierce competition with each other. They accuse each other, and they did so again today, of basically sabotaging each other's growth. What is the way forward here?
It's very hard to say. I mean, if you look at the areas where they think, or where Blinken's, the American readout at least, said that they had actually had some constructive discussions. It was about, AI governance, about people-to-people exchanges, so students maybe going backwards and forwards, and academics. The climate change, is obviously something they can talk about. Fentanyl control, which the Chinese have promised to get on top of. So these kinds of areas, obviously, there's discussion about, and the military dialogue actually has resumed, so that's a good thing. But, Janet Yellen was talking about overcapacity when she was in China a couple of weeks ago. Blinken was talking about it again today. The EU Commission itself has kind of concerns about this as well. And the problem is that the Chinese economy, it's endemic, it's structurally kind of built into their model, is to kind of overproduce and to concentrate on supply rather than demand in the economy. So that's why we've had problems with steel and aluminum in the past, why we have problems nowadays with electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels and so on, shipbuilding and logistics. So there's no real kind of resolution that I can see here, because, what the Chinese model is not going to change for the benefit of the United States or Europe. And they will just carry on doing what they do. And so we will have, unfortunately, more kind of trade friction, I think, to come.
That's George Magnus from the China Center at Oxford University. Thank you so much for your analysis and your time.
Thank you.
And I'm joined now by Bonnie Glaser. She's the managing director of the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific program. Bonnie, welcome back to the day. I want to jump right in and talk about Blinken's warning there that relations with Europe cannot improve as long as Beijing supports Moscow. Is that true?
Well, I do think that Europe is increasingly concerned about China's support for its defense industrial base and enabling Moscow to prosecute the war in Ukraine. And the threat is not just to Ukraine. It is the fact that Russia is acquiring capabilities that in the future it could use against Europe. So this has become a really high priority for Europe and also for the United States.
Is it a priority for Beijing, though?
Well, I think that the Russia-China relationship is a priority for Beijing, but it also wants to maintain stability in its relationship with the United States and improve ties with Europe. And we will see China's leader Xi Jinping, in fact, go to Europe and visit 3 countries very soon. So I think that China wants to thread this needle carefully. It really does not want to damage its relations with any actor.
Mm-hmm. It's not only China that is interested in stabilizing relations, though, right? The U.S. has the same interest in mind, and Blinken threatened sanctions if China continued to support Russia. How risky a move is that at a moment where both Washington and Beijing seem rather keen to mend the ties?
Well, the optimal outcome is that if China takes actions against the companies that are supplying these defense capabilities, to Russia. And of course, we're talking about components and machine tools, dual-use equipment, propellants for missiles. I believe that the United States and probably Europe have shared specific information with Beijing and hope that they will shut down these companies. But yes, if those efforts do not produce the results that U.S. and Europe want to see, it looks like the United States is considering imposing sanctions on Chinese banks, which would cut off their access to the U.S. dollar. Now, of course, there are some banks in China, regional banks, that don't rely on the dollar, and 90% of interactions between Russia and China actually are done now in currencies other than the U.S. dollar. But of course, imposing sanctions on Chinese banks would be very consequential.
Trade is always a big topic between the world's two biggest economies, isn't it? Let's listen to some of what Blinken had to say on the matter.
I also expressed our concern about the PRC's unfair trade practices and the potential consequences of industrial overcapacity for global and U.S. markets, especially in a number of key industries that will drive the 21st century economy, like solar panels, electric vehicles, and the batteries that power them.
Overcapacity is the buzzword right now when it comes to China, isn't it, Bonnie? Blinken accusing China of engaging in unfair trade practices. Beijing, on the other hand, says the U.S. is hampering its economic development. Who's right?
Well, I associate myself with Secretary of State Blinken on this issue. China has pursued unfair trade practices for a very, very long time. We've seen massive subsidies given to their industries. They have not respected intellectual property, many cases of stealing IP, and giving preferences to Chinese companies over Western companies, so they don't give fair access to the Chinese market. But yes, there's an issue that overcapacity is raising, not just for the United States, but for many countries around the world. I believe that Secretary of State Blinken said that China is contributing to about 1/3 of global production and about 1/10 of consumer spending. So China really needs to boost consumer spending. They need to balance this. They can't just export all of their capacity, their excess production to other countries, or there, I think, will be a really significant response, and that will contribute negatively to China's relations with the world. And we're talking about some developing countries, too, like Brazil, not just Europe and the United States.
Yeah. Another point of contention are China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. Antony Blinken repeated the U.S. position of ironclad support for the Philippines and its sovereign claims. How do you see that playing out in the future?
China has been harassing the Filipinos as they try to provide food and water to a very small number of Marines that sit on this dilapidated, rusting out ship that is on a rock that is below water at high tide. So it is hard to believe that we could go to war over this kind of issue. And I think that that's exactly what the United States wants to prevent. So the messages to the Chinese are, please recognize the United States has a treaty commitment to the Philippines. If there is an injury to a Filipino, if the Philippines opts to invoke the treaty with the United States, Washington will come to the aid of the Philippines. So the United States doesn't want to see any miscalculation on this issue.
That was Bonnie Glaser of the German Marshall Fund. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for all those insights.
Thanks for having me.
I'm joined by Lily McElwee. She's the Deputy Director and Fellow in the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to DW. Now, Blinken did not come away from China with any concessions or agreements. So what was the point of this trip?
Thanks, Nicole, for having me on. I think the point of this trip was certainly not to move the needle on substantive issues. I don't think that was the expectation really on either side coming into the meeting. But we've seen over the past year a desire from both the Biden administration and Beijing to have a temporary, at least temporary, stabilization of the relationship. There are some really big geopolitical issues, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, that both countries are dealing with. The Chinese economy is slowing down. The Biden administration is facing an election. I think both want to continue the temporary stabilization that we have seen. So my assessment is that this visit, like the visits we've seen from Yellen, the phone call between Xi and Biden, is an investment in that stabilization, at least temporarily.
One of the most contentious issues between China and the U.S. is always trade. China accused Washington of suppressing what they called their legitimate development rights. The U.S. complains about China flooding the world with cheap products. Is there any way to find common ground here?
Well, that's a very good question. I think you have to look at the context of this visit. And, the U.S. has just passed the TikTok divestment bill. The Biden administration has been very rigorous and consistent in its development of technology controls where it sees Chinese practices harming U.S. security. And China, for its matter, is facing an economic slowdown and plans to export its way out of this slowdown. These are going to create further frictions. So this temporary stabilization, these open lines of communication, are really important because we're going to see added and continued challenges on the trade front going forward.
Mm-hmm. In the past, there was a lot of talk about guardrails. None of that anymore. What happened?
I think it's pretty clear from both sides that there are major structural issues. So really what both sides are doing now is trying to find modicum little areas of cooperation. AI is one of them. We're going to have talks soon. The Biden-Xi call I mentioned, these open lines of communication, military to military communication. Fentanyl is an area where we've seen moderate progress, but it's really about communication where we have these structural challenges and talking about them, and finding small areas for the U.S. and China to work together. But I think there's a recognition on both sides that those structural frictions aren't going to change anytime soon.
That was Lily McElwee of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks for your input.
Thank you.